Every single offseason on this channel, I love to go through past NHL drafts and redraft them. But today I want to do something a little bit different. We're going to go through the 2022 NHL Draft 3 years later and grade every single first round pick, going from the best and the worst. Specifically with the 2022 draft, it seems to be a lot of variance between the best and the worst picks, but we're going to be grading them from F all the way to A+ to see which picks are the best and the worst 3 years later. So what are my thoughts on the 2022 draft and all the picks we saw inside the first round up to this point? Well, make sure you guys watch till the end because we're going to be talking about a ton of these top prospects and how their careers have developed. And make sure that subscribe button if you're new for more hockey draft content as we go through this offseason with a lot more rankings to come. Now, of course, it has to be said that we're only 3 years away from this draft, so there are prospects that might not even be looking that great now that could still turn a page and become future NHLers, but 3 years later, we're starting to get a good idea of how this draft class is truly shaping up. And one of the reasons why I want to go to the first round specifically is that a lot of the good players in this draft class too are outside of the first round. Players like Fraser Minton, Seamus Casey, and of course Lane Hutson drafted in the late second round. So going through a lot of these first rounders that haven't quite lived up to the same expectations, I think is pretty interesting. Now we're going to start out the grades here today with the main man himself and Yuri Slafkovsky, the former first overall pick by the Montreal Canadiens, and his career has been in a weird up and down trajectory since then. It's a weird situation because in both of these last couple of seasons, he started off pretty poorly and a lot of question marks about that first overall draft position. And then the second half comes along and he is a completely different player in terms of the production, in terms of the intensity, and he finally starts to look like a first overall selection. Slafkovsky still has a lot of room to grow, but I think this next season is kind of a put up or shut up moment for him to really show what he is made of. If he can have a fully consistent, strung out season, then I think that could be huge for him. But as of right now, I think he projects more just as a decent first overall pick, but nothing quite special yet. Now, when it comes to my grades, a straight C is an average selection, but I do think Slafkovsky is just a bit above that, likely to C+, but I'm going to give him a B- for this range, just because I think there's still more potential for him to give us, really. But even if he's not the most amazing first overall pick or anything, this draft didn't really have a ton of fantastic options looking back at things. There's only a couple players that I would really put over Slafkovsky definitively right now, so for that, I don't think it's a bad or wasted pick whatsoever. Now going on to a much more questionable Solvag pick inside the top two, we go on to Simone Mets of the New Jersey Devils. As a second overall pick, it was pretty similar to Montreal, really wanting a bigger power forward. New Jersey really wanted a defenseman, and even though they didn't really need a second overall position or anything, they ended up going after Simone Mets at that spot. And with Slafkovsky, even though he's had his ups and downs, there's pretty clear potential there that he's still yet to fill. In the Mets' case, that is also the situation, but he has failed to really establish himself at all in the NHL up to this point. Though, of course, in the playoffs versus Carolina this last year, I thought he was pretty solid getting 2 points in 4 games, so maybe he's able to carry that over, but still, so far there's been some pretty massive growing pains, especially defensively, and the offense hasn't been enough to really make up for that. Even though I'm still a bit hopeful that the Mets can turn around, I'm going to give the pick right now a D+. It's not a complete failure yet, but especially as a second overall pick, has not been nearly the type of defenseman you'd want at that draft position. Though, again, like we're factoring in with Slafkovsky in that first overall selection, there's not a ton of defensemen that were around this range in draft rankings that are that much clearly better than Simone Mets. Obviously, looking back, Lane Hutson is the best defenseman of this draft class for sure, but he was never going to be a second overall selection. So considering that, I don't think the Devils did terribly, but again, hasn't exactly worked out yet. On to the third overall pick, and the Arizona Coyotes now turn to the Utah Mammoth, and this is going to be our first A+ of the day. To me, Logan Culin has been a fantastic pick for Utah at that third overall selection, and we're talking about with Slafkovsky, with the Mets, those players trying to fill holes. Culin has been exactly what that franchise needed, that type of dynamic puck carrier that really has translated pretty perfectly onto the NHL so far. He's yet to fully put up the elite NHL numbers yet, but he's been one of the most productive ones out there in this draft class. This last year, getting 40 assists, 65 points in 75 games. This is just somebody that just breathes so much creativity, so much moxie to his game. And I think that's exactly what Utah needed more of, especially with players like Clayton Keller. Having somebody to dance along with him, I think, was vitally important. But to get somebody at the level of Cooley at third overall was pretty impressive. Obviously, Utah got a bit lucky that Montreal was looking for a wing and that New Jersey was never going to take another center. But in that case, still, the value at third overall, it's hard to ignore. Now, going on to another pick that I think is pretty strong value in Shane Wright going to the Seattle Kraken. Maybe not as good value as Logan Cooley, but still pretty solid. Even though this is probably the range where Shane Wright, looking back, would probably still end up, I think a 4th overall selection for Wright, considering the options, isn't the worst thing in the world, especially with what he was able to prove this last year, being a full-time NHLer, playing 79 games for the Kraken, and looking really good, especially down the stretch. 19 goals, 44 points. I think during those couple of months there, especially at the turn of the year, he was pretty easily the Kraken's best forward, and production-wise was one of their most efficient, still not even playing that many minutes and getting over 40 points. That to me was a huge turnaround because Wright was kind of in this no man's land situation, still progressing from the CHL to the AHL, kind of wondering what he would be at the NHL level, but I think he's pretty clearly established that and has established himself as a big part of that Kraken future. I'm going to give it a B+. Another situation pretty similar to the Cooley one where they ended up having a pretty solid player drop to them, but a 4th overall, I think it was solid value all around, and especially for the Kraken, getting that type of offensive player is sorely needed. Now, finishing off the top 5, we're going to go into another solid pick here with Cutter Gauthier. Now, maybe not for the Philadelphia Flyers, and that's why the grade might be a little bit lower. I'm factoring in the team and how they did with this selection too, but Cutter Gauthier as a 5th overall pick, I think it's turned out pretty good for that selection. Nothing crazy, I'm going to give the pick a straight B, but I think Cutter Gauthier has turned into a really solid player since then, and especially since his draft year has really been able to ramp up that offense, ramp up the goal scoring, and in Anaheim, even though he wasn't as explosive as maybe I was foreseeing him to be, he still got 20 goals, still got 44 points in a system that was really strange for younger players out there. But I think Gauthier did just fine, and I think this next year especially, with a big opportunity in that top 6, I think is going to really start exploding here. Now on to the next 5 picks in the top 10, which had some more misses than the previous 5. We're going to start out with David Juraj, who is just a strange one. Being drafted 6th overall by Columbus, now traded to the Minnesota Wild. He's one that I think is also trying to find his identity, especially once he ends up making the NHL full-time. He's something that in the AHL level, especially for Iowa, didn't really explode by any means, but is trying to work on that defensive game, trying to get faster, and that's kind of been the big focal point of progression. We'll see if he's able to get there because he still has good physical traits, still has decent skating ability to him, but just finding that confidence, I think, has been a big problem for him so far, and a reason why the grade's not going to look too pretty. As of right now, I'm not going to give him a complete F because I think there is still time to turn it around, but I'm going to give him a D-, just because of how it's progressed up to this point, the lackluster 5-on-5 play in both the NHL and AHL level. I just don't think his future is looking amazing right now, but obviously, still a lot of time for a 21-year-old D. Another one that hasn't looked amazing up to this point, especially going towards the NHL, and Kevin Korchinski of the Chicago Blackhawks. Now, I was never as big of a Korchinski guy. I had him more so in my mid-teens range rather than at number 7 overall, but I think Korchinski still has a lot of potential to round out as an offensive defenseman, but another one like Juraj that I think is just trying to round out that game, become a little bit more projectable, and get a lot more trust once he does enter the NHL, because it's kind of been a bit of a hit or miss. He played a bunch of games in 2024, had some major issues, then started out the year with Chicago, but wasn't really able to capture many minutes, got almost immediately sent down to the AHL, and looked okay there, but still some pretty big growing pains. This is another one that's not nearly as definitive as some of the others, but I'm going to give it a D+ right now. I do think Korchinski looked a lot better in the AHL playoffs, so hopefully that's something to build upon. I would still like to see him in the AHL again next year to really round out the defensive game and make it a lot more consistent, but I still think Korchinski can be a decent power play quarterback. It just feels like in Chicago's system, though, he's kind of been phased out a little bit by some of the higher end prospects there. Now we move on to a prospect that's actually looking really good right now in Marco Kasper of the Detroit Red Wings. Somebody that I've always loved watching with the motor and the quickness in his game, but he's somebody that's translated really well to the NHL because of those attributes. And you can see this last year after playing a pretty solid AHL rookie campaign. He got 77 games with the Wings, got 19 goals, 37 points, especially after December. He was one of the most productive Red Wings, one of the most productive players in this draft class. He was really able to show what he was made of, and I love to see that because I think the talent has always been there, but he's starting to get a little bit more confident how to and really utilize those skills even more efficiently, which for a player like Kasper that has the motor he has, like we talked about, is something that has been a really interesting part to add to that toolbox, and a reason why I think he's already become a successful NHLer. I'm going to give the pick an A- up to this point. Maybe not the most electrifying 8th overall pick, but a really under the radar one that I don't think really should, because the talent is there, and also the versatility within the Red Wings lineup has been really important for them trying to boost up that offense. Casper has been a main part of it though, and a big reason for hope in the future. On to 9th overall, another player that's had some major question marks. We go on to Matthew Savoie, formerly of the Buffalo Sabres, now with the Edmonton Oilers. I'm going to give this pick a straight D though, because as of right now, it doesn't look fantastic. He's one of those players that unfortunately I think is kind of in no man's land right now. Not good enough to be a top sixer right now, but also playing in the bottom six is especially risky, especially for a team like Edmonton that needs to get every single win possible. He was pretty solid in the AHL this last year, but again, I think it might be another situation where he gets passed up again. I mean, I could see a player like Isaac Howard playing a lot more minutes this next season, which we'll talk about in just a bit. I think he could be the younger winger that comes into the Edmonton team, and that's the player they take the risk on this next season. So in Savoie's case, it might be another year in the AHL, and by the time he's 22, maybe he gets NHL minutes. It just kind of seems like a stretch to this point, even if he's a top 10 pick. Moving on to 10th overall and the Anaheim Ducks, we go on to Pavel Mintyukov, somebody that I like quite a bit and have always liked in terms of the smarts and the consistency there. He's been a pretty big, fascinating project because he's been up and down in terms of his stock. You saw how he was able to start out his NHL career last year, getting 28 points in 63 games, looking like a fantastic defenseman in the future. This last year, though, didn't quite get as much of attention there, but I thought he was pretty consistent again, making the right decisions, nothing all too flashy, just the production wasn't as impressive. But I think this next year, he's going to take another bigger step. That is a 10th overall pick, somebody that I think projects pretty well as a middle pair defenseman. I think that's a straight B. Really solid pick there by the Ducks. On to the 11th overall selection, another Arizona pick here, and another player that's also been traded in Connor Geekie, now of the Tampa Bay Lightning. Now, I think Geekie's going to be an interesting one because I don't think he's going to be much more than just a solid third-line complimentary player, but I think he could be pretty solid in that role. As a bigger forward, somebody that can play center and wing, he's something that I think has had some pretty good chemistry in the past with Tampa Bay, but hasn't been able to string that along consistently. But this last year in 52 games, got 14 points, 8 goals. Not bad in terms of the goal scoring department, and the AHL level also doing pretty well for Syracuse. But that's the thing for Geekie, is that I think at 11th overall, it was always a bit much for me and probably still is, but I think a straight C is pretty fine here. An average selection, he's not going to wow you by any means, I don't think, as a top 6 player, but a solid piece still in your core. Now, going on to a player that has really started to turn a page here in terms of his NHL projection, in Denton Mateychuk of the Columbus Blue Jackets. Now, he's going to be an interesting piece here because he's always been somebody that I was a little bit lower on, more so in the late teens in terms of my rankings. But Mateychuk is somebody that has actually started to look pretty solid in that Columbus system, going from the WHL, where he obviously put up massive numbers there as one of the most creative offensive defensemen you'll see. He's somebody that I always had concerns with actually translating to the NHL, but I think he's really started to wrap up that decision-making, make things quicker, making things more efficient, and create a lot less risk for himself and his teammates. And I think what you've been able to see in the AHL and NHL level this last year for the Blue Jackets was pretty special to see. Something that in the AHL level looked fantastic, but I think was able to hold his own pretty confidently with the Blue Jackets, even though he didn't get the most time on ice in the world. I think this next year we'll see another bump in his role and actually start to be a core piece of that team. I'm going to give the pick a straight B because right now it's looking pretty good at number 12. Now, going on to another pick that's looking pretty good, we go on to Frank Nazar of the Chicago Blackhawks. I'm going to give this pick a straight A, especially with what we saw with Nazar this last year. I think that really has changed my view on him because even though I've always seen him as this really skilled forward, the translatability was always a bit of a question mark, similarly to maybe a Kent Johnson, for example, in Columbus. But this last year, after putting up massive numbers in the AHL level, he was forcing the Blackhawks basically to call him up. They did, and I thought he looked pretty great there, especially in those last few weeks of the season. He got 26 points, 53 in 53 games, 12 goals, 14 assists. I thought he was easily one of the most dynamic Chicago players immediately, using that confidence and skill set to his advantage. And I think if he continues to do that, the sky's still the limit for what he's capable of. On to 14th overall, and a pretty curious one as another American forward. We go into Rutger McGrody of the Winnipeg Jets, now of the Pittsburgh Penguins. He's somebody that I'm pretty curious to see if he's actually a full-time NHLer this next year, or if he's going to get another year in the AHL. It's interesting because this season, starting in the AHL level after being demoted from the NHL, he was pretty rough. The production wasn't there, the confidence wasn't there, but something started to click, and eventually the AHL production really got going, and by the end of things, he got 39 points and 14 goals in 60 games. I still think McGrody can be just a solid middle six forward, something that is really competent, especially on the power play, getting in the right positions to create offense, but I don't think there's anything truly special about him. That combined with the skating inefficiencies means that I think his projection is a bit limited, but I still think at 14th overall, it's a fine pick. I'm going to give it a C right now. Now, at 15th overall, we go to a player that I think might also be up and down in terms of the NHL and AHL of this next year. We go on to Jonathan Lekkerimäki. And it's interesting because I think the Brock Besser signing makes Lekkerimäki's placement in Vancouver a little bit more curious for the future. That combined with players like Kiefer Sherwood and Connor Garland makes that right side a bit more stuffed out. But I think in Lekkerimäki's case, he's going to eventually be able to win that spot because of the natural talent. The goal scoring, especially in transition, is one of the best of the players we'll talk about today. This last year, still solid production in the AHL, and I didn't think he was outmatched when he played in the NHL level this last year, even though there were some still defensive issues. I think in Lekkerimäki's case, though, I think he's translated a little bit better than I would have expected up to this point, and I'm going to give it a C+. Still a ton of potential there as a power play goal scorer. Moving on to another Swede here, we go on to Noah Östlund of the Buffalo Sabres, not traded up to this point, but I'm going to give the pick a C- right now. Östlund was somebody I was really high on in his draft here, and hasn't quite done as much as I wanted him to, but still, the production is quite radiant, and the skill set when he is given that space is to die for. This last year in the AHL, 36 points in 45 games. I just have some major question marks about that translatability, especially in Buffalo's system, but I want Östlund to work so bad. On to another European forward here. Let's go on to Joakim Kemell of the Nashville Predators. Somebody that has had some really good production in the AHL level. Back-to-back years with 40-plus points. This last year, 40 points and 19 goals in 65 games. Even though the assists have not been bad at the AHL level so far, I think that goal scoring is going to be the biggest thing for him. Kind of like a Lekkerimäki, how much of an opportunistic player he is and how good of a goal scorer he is in tight, I think could really make the difference there. I think in Kemell's case, though, he's something that I have a little bit of worries about the physicality, how he's going to be able to push back against that at the NHL level, how much space there's going to be, but as of right now, I still think it's a fine pick. I'm going to give it a C-. Nothing special right now, still a wait and see, but hopefully he can find some room on Nashville's roster in these next couple of years. Now let's move on to somebody that has been able to find a spot on a pretty crowded position for their team. Let's go on to Liam Bichsel of the Dallas Stars, somebody that I knew was going to be a fan favorite for the Stars, and I think has pretty immediately become that. Somebody that was a fascinating pick at 18th overall. I was super high on him, but I was also a little bit surprised to see him drafted as high as he was. But at 6'7", 231 pounds, the physical play, the skating ability, at the same time, maybe I shouldn't have been, because I've always have been a big fan of Liam, and I think he's turned out pretty well. The point production won't ever be spectacular, but considering he got 9 points in 38 games and has been able to be pretty much an everyday player, not just in the regular season, but also the playoffs now for the Stars, that's a pretty massive success, especially for that left side of the defense, which again is pretty crowded. I think Bichsel is just going to round out really well, though, as a number 5, number 4 defenseman that just brings some big punishing hits, is just solid and dependable in his own zone, and is able to get out of his own zone pretty efficiently. And considering that type of selection at 18th overall, I think it was a fantastic selection. I'm going to give it a B+. Yes, there might be some bias because I love him so much, but I love him for a reason. Now let's move on to another Swede here. Let's move on to the Minnesota Wild and their selection of Liam Öhgren. Now it's really fascinating to see that trio of Djurgården guys in Öhgren, Lekkerimäki, and Östlund and how their careers have panned out, because it seems like Öhgren right now has the most potential in terms of translating onto the NHL full-time. And as of right now, I'm going to give the pick a straight B, just because I think he has rounded out so well in the North American game so far. You see at the AHL level, almost a point per game, 37 points in 41 games in his first full season in the AHL level. But I thought he was also pretty decent for Minnesota when he was playing, 5 points in 24 games for them. It seems like he's going to be a pretty decent part of that bottom 6 for Minnesota, hopefully this next year. Potentially with Danila Yurov on a third line. Those two would be a ton of fun. But I think in Öhgren's case, it's always been about how competent he is, how calculated he is, that I think really projects him well, and I think at the NHL level we'll eventually see that round out pretty solidly. On to 20th overall, we're going to go on to a player that we've had to have some massive patience in for medical reasons, of course, but I think it's turned out to be a pretty great North American player already, in eLiaminator Shevchenko of the Washington Capitals. Now, I'm not sure what the projection lies right now because of Washington and how much depth they have right now, but I don't think it's a bad thing to give Miro Shevchenko some more time, because I think he's turned out to be a pretty good AHL player at the very least. I mean, this last year, 23 goals, 42 points in 53 games, and a pretty solid player in the playoffs. 5 points and 3 goals in 8 games there too. I think in Miroshnichenko's case, he's a little bit more of a boomer bust guy. Somebody I think needs some more power play time, needs some more space to be able to create, but still a pretty crafty player, especially physically. And I think that might be able to bring him some more NHL minutes than maybe some people expect. Still, though, at 20th overall, I'm going to give the pick a C-. Hasn't turned out completely yet, but at 20th overall, I think Miroshnichenko's turned out pretty well for that spot. Moving on from the Washington Capitals to the Pittsburgh Penguins selection here, let's go on to Owen Pickering, who I think is looking pretty decent for his range at 21st overall. Somebody that I think has been on a fascinating curve, considering I don't think he was a dominant WHLer by any means, has always had this big potential, but has kind of felt like he's always been reaching to try to find that consistency. But he burst onto the scene this last year for Pittsburgh. I thought in the 25 games he played was pretty decent, considering the team around him, especially defensively. And in the AHL level, he wasn't brilliant or anything, but I still think was pretty solid in the games he played. I think he could be pretty similar to William Bichsel if he really rounds out his defensive gaming and alleviate some of those minor issues, because I think the physical play, the skating, has always been a pretty big part of Pickering's game. It's just kind of making those quick decisions, rounding things out as much as he has. But I think he's made some big improvements in that category, and I could see him being a pretty solid number 5, maybe number 4 defenseman when it's all said and done, especially considering the Penguins pool and the lack of great defensive options. I think Pickering is developing solidly. Nothing fantastic yet, but I think has had some good promise. So I'm going to give the pick a C+ as of now. Onto a pick that I don't think is rounding out nearly as well, though. Let's go on to the Anaheim Ducks and their selection of Nathan Gauthier at 22nd overall. Now, admittedly, I was never a big fan of Gauthier personally, and at 22nd, I just didn't really see it at the time, and I still don't really see it right now, I'm going to be honest. I mean, Gauthier could be maybe an okay 4th line center at the very best, but right now, I still don't think he's really projecting towards that. He's somebody that I think has some pretty bad penalty troubles here and there, doesn't really have a lot of offense in his game that I think is really inspiring right now, but he's become an okay AHL player. Nothing's fantastic, again, nothing that's going to blow your mind, but I think he's always been a good face-off guy. Physically, has always been extremely mature there, so there are good things to build upon. I just don't think the pick was ever really all that inspiring, especially at number 22. Let's move on to a player that absolutely will be an everyday NHLer as soon as this next year. Let's go on to the St. Louis Blues and them selecting Jimmy Snuggerud. This pick is looking absolutely fantastic, and spoiler alert, it's another A+. It's interesting because there was a couple of players that went really high in this draft class coming from the NCDP that I don't think were quite showing as much offense as they could have brought. Snuggerud is one. I think Cutter Gauthier was another, but in Snuggerud's case, immediately after his draft year, we saw so much more of the explosive offense that he was able to create. It was inconsistent in the NCDP, but in the NCAA, it was every single game, and on top of the great foundational base defensively, he was able to show unreal goal scoring, especially in transition, a great power play quarterbacking ability, and that has led to a lot of success with the University of Minnesota. And once he stepped onto the ice for the Blues, you started to see the versatility in his game, how he was able to play different roles and already look pretty comfortable, both in the regular season and in the playoffs. He's a core part of this Blues team going forward, and I would not be surprised if he's playing first-line minutes as soon as this October. On to another player who will be playing some pretty big everyday minutes, hopefully this next year. We go on to eLiaminator of the Minnesota Wild, somebody that has always had some big boomer bust potential, but I think in terms of the play, he's going to round out as a really solid two-way center, and somebody that 24th overall looks to be a really solid pick. Somebody that, especially since his draft year, after not really playing a ton in his draft year, especially minutes-wise, he's gotten a lot more responsibility and a lot more opportunity, thankfully, and these last couple of seasons putting up some great production in the KHL. I think in Yurov's case, you're kind of looking at a Mikael Backlund type of player, a really great foundational defensive player, somebody that leads by example in a lot of ways, but I don't think he's ever going to put up unbelievable point numbers at the NHL. Still, though, at 24th overall, I think that's a fantastic player to have, and I'm going to give the pick a B+. Yurov's looking really good for me so far, and I'm hoping to see that continue. Now on to another really solid pick here. Let's go on to Sam Renzel being selected by the Chicago Blackhawks at 25th overall. And you guys might have seen when I was talking about a player like Kevin Korchinski and him kind of being swallowed up by some of the prospects going ahead of him in the depth chart. Well, I think Sam Renzel is probably the prospect that has leapfrogged him the most, going from a player that was drafted before him at 25th overall to, in my opinion, maybe being Chicago's one of their best defensive prospects. Lev Shunov probably would still be number 1, but I don't think Sam Renzel is that far behind. What we were able to witness, though, in his 9 games with Chicago this last year, I think has really raised his projection. He looked immediately comfortable and immediately looked like a top 4 defenseman for them. Somebody that led by example in a lot of ways, but was just having so many great quick decisions from the blue line, was able to read opponents and teammates so well, and already looked like an established 10-year NHL veteran, which is fantastic news for Chicago, because I think Rinzel could be a pretty under-the-radar Calder candidate next year for just how well he's played. Maybe not quite an A+ right now, but I'm going to give the pick a straight A. One of the best Chicago's made over these last few years, and especially at 25 overall, fantastic value. Now, not quite as good value coming up next with the Montreal Canadiens selecting 26th overall Philippe Machar. And this one is a sad case because I think Machar was always kind of one of my favorites to watch back in his draft year. The translatability was maybe a bit of a question mark, sure, but what a crafty, shifty player that just has not been able to fully translate that offensive game really since his draft year. I mean, he had a great season in Slovakia, but then going into the OHL, just never was able to put up great production there. And in the AHL level in his first year, granted, of course, he is still a rookie, was only able to get 18 points in 42 games, especially for this point where you really wanted to see some change in his play and his development and get a lot better, a lot more consistent. That still has really yet to come in Machar's game. I'm still hopeful he can maybe be a bottom 6 piece, but considering his size and considering his game, I just don't know if that's much of a likelihood at this point. Unfortunately, I'm going to give the pick a D-. Because it's a 26th overall, I don't think it's the end of the world. I think Machar has disappointed quite a bit since 2022. Moving on now to 27th overall and going on to a big center in this class, somebody that I think has had a big development curve, but I think has really been able to play up to expectations so far, in Philippe Bystedt of the San Jose Sharks. And he's somebody that I think just rounds out especially well as a third-line physical center of the future. Nothing that's going to wow you, but especially in your bottom 6, you need players like Philippe Bystedt to really carry lines defensively, make things easy, bring a physical base to the game, and a layer that makes it hard for other opponents. And I think Bystedt is going to do exactly that, especially when you're going to have the center core of Celebrini, Misa. Having a player like Bystedt as that really third wave is going to do a lot of good for them. Even though the production I don't think will ever be amazing for Bystedt, I think he will most likely go as more of a 35, 40 point type of center. Still, at that third center spot, I think that is especially important to have. And with how solid of a base Bystedt provides, I think he's going to end up being a great pick. As of right now, I'm going to give it a B-. Again, nothing special, but at this range, getting a core piece of your bottom 6 ain't a bad thing at all. Now, if you can find a good bottom 6er in this range, that's solid. If you can find a great top 6er, then that's even better. And that's exactly what the Buffalo Sabres did, getting Yuri Kulich at 28th overall. This to me is looking like one of the best value picks of that entire 2022 draft. I mean, he's something that has truly exploded since his draft year. I liked him a lot when he played for Czechia and, of course, for a team Czechia at the U18s and U20s. I thought he looked great there in a power play role, but the 5-on-5 play was a bit of a question mark offensively. Maybe it still is to a certain extent, but I think Kulich has really been able to show how game-breaking skill is able to win over. But I thought Kulich was always a pretty strong defensive player too, especially in creating turnovers and getting out of his own zone. But we've seen that offense really take a ways, and you see in 62 games this last year, 15 goals, 24 points, nothing exceptional, but he was able to play a pretty strong role with Buffalo already, and I think would have had more production if he just had some better players around him consistently. But I think in Kulich's case, he's already starting to develop into what you want to see out of him, and even better at that rate, especially at his 28th overall pick. It's an A+ for me pretty automatically. I don't know if Kulich will be a true first-line center long-term, but I think at very least a top 6 one, and if he's a second-line center, 28th overall, you'll take that every day of the week. At number 29, we're going to go into somebody that I was quite a bit wrong about in Maverick Lamaroo, formerly of the Arizona Coyotes, now of the Utah Mammoth, and somebody that I think has developed quite a bit better than I expected him to, as a bigger defenseman and a decent skating base. That's kind of all I saw out of Lamaroo in his draft year, which may be sour on his projection quite a bit, but I think he's been really able to round out that offensive game just enough to be able to get by, and especially with the confidence and the assertion in his game, he's playing a lot more confident, he's playing a lot more risky, and I like to see that out of Lamaroo. But he's still going to be a solid, dependable bottom pair defenseman, I think, when it's all said and done. Something that when he was able to play for Utah this last year, I think was able to float, able to survive, which, considering his lackluster experience in the pro level, I think is pretty impressive to see. Still not something that I think projects as a top pair defenseman or anything, but at 29th overall, it's not the end of the world getting a player like Lambert. On to number 30, and this is a very sad case. If the Lamaroo pick was like a C+ type of range for me, I think Brad Lambert is a C range for me personally. I think it's a pretty average pick, mostly just because I think Lambert deserves to be in a bigger organization for him personally, because Winnipeg and how stacked they are, especially in their depth, especially on the wings, they want to have more physical presences. Lambert just really hasn't been able to get that opportunity so far, but I think deserves it up to this point. He's somebody that's been a solid AHL player, and in an AHL team like Manitoba that has been as bad as they have been, I think he's done pretty well for himself. It's unfortunate because I think on most other NHL teams, he would have already gotten a pretty solid opportunity on a middle six already, but it just hasn't been able to happen because of how built Winnipeg is at this point. I want to see him get a better opportunity, potentially with somebody else, but I think at this point, it's just kind of a wait and see. On to 31st overall, and we go into a player that's been up and down in terms of projection, but especially now is looking quite good in Isaac Howard, formerly of the Tampa Bay Lightning and now newly traded to the Edmonton Oilers. Now, I think the Oilers are going to be a pretty good spot for him. I think they could pretty immediately give him a top 9 spot as a left wing, which is exactly, of course, what Isaac Howard is wanting. But he's somebody that's gone up and down in terms of the projection, mostly because he had a really rough freshman year with University of Minnesota Duluth. It was fine, it was okay, but not what the expectation was. But once he got to Michigan State, he was actually dealing with a heart issue, and they were able to fix that up, and pretty immediately Howard was able to show exactly what he was made of. A point per game in the NCAA this last year, and I think a pretty deserving Hobey Baker winner. He's something that is just so explosive, so smart with the way he's able to handle the puck, and is able to drive a line so cleanly. I think in Edmonton's case, he's exactly the type of winger they could use a bit more of, especially the electricity he has as a person, as a character, as a player, and I think in Edmonton he's going to fit quite well. Still a wait and see, so I'm going to give the pick a straight B right now, but I think considering what he's projecting to be, I think at 31st overall, it's pretty great value from that spot. Now, unfortunately, we kind of end the first round here with a bit of a whimper, going to Reed Schaefer as another player that was traded, going from an Edmonton Oilers draft pick at 32nd overall, now in the Nashville Predators system. Now, Reed Schaefer was always a bit of a questionable 32nd overall pick to me, a lot more of a solid second round type of level prospect. I think at that range, he would have been quite solid, but I think the expectation of a first round pick has kind of been a bit of a looming cloud over his career. But I think when he was traded to Nashville, he was okay in the AHL level this last year, and it got 14 points in 19 games when he was actually healthy. Unfortunately, hasn't played since December, but another guy that has some good physical traits, has always been a pretty responsible player overall. It's just kind of a wait and see to see if that offense actually does translate, but I wouldn't expect much more than just a solid fourth line piece if he is to make it. So for that reason, I'm going to give it just a straight D and end off the video here. Just because I said that, Reed Schaefer is going to put up 80 points in Nashville next year. Book it. But those are my grades for the first round of the 2022 draft 3 years later. A lot of changes within this first round. I love to see that. So much variance and so much wackiness looking back on it. What a weird draft this was, but that's why I love talking about these drafts and seeing how they've turned out. If you guys enjoyed the grades, make sure you guys hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell. Comment down below your thoughts on my grades, what you guys agree and disagree with, and what you grade the picks that your team made, or just the first round in general, maybe the top 5. I'd love to know your thoughts down below. Of course, share it with all the hockey fans you guys know online, and click on this card for all of my draft content right in one playlist, and I will see you guys in the next one. Make sure you have a fantastic hockey day, and goodbye.